This is Mark Sobel, U.S. Chair, OMFIF. Today, I'm delighted to be joined for this keynote session by John Morton, Climate Counselor in the U.S. Treasury to Secretary Janet Yellen. John leads and coordinates many of Treasury's efforts in its new climate hub to address climate change. John has a long distinguished career working on environmental issues, including during the Obama administration as the White House Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change. Welcome, John.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, great. So the Obama administration worked hard at home and closely with international partners to tackle global climate challenges. After a major retreat in the last administration, the Biden administration is working again to lead the discussion. Global temperatures are already 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The IMF has estimated that a global carbon price of about $75 a ton is needed to reduce emissions enough to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, but that the global average price is only $3 a ton. Other studies say we're headed to a warming of 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. So intensified efforts are needed, especially this decade. COP26 therefore becomes quite crucial. What are the Biden administration's major objectives for COP26? And why shouldn't a skeptic such as myself think that the world is losing the race against time?
Well, you've just outed yourself as a skeptic early on in this conversation. So now I know who I'm, the audience I'm addressing here. Those are all great questions, Mark. So let me start at the top and say, first of all, that this administration, obviously, there should be no doubt of the kind of priority and attention that the Biden administration is placing on climate. It was part of the campaign, obviously, and has been very much part of the early months of this administration in terms of prioritization. A number of executive orders that have been issued, a number of domestic regulatory actions, and as you referenced, a number of international efforts, both led by Treasury, but also supported by Special Envoy Kerry in his role as our chief kind of climate diplomat. I think if you look at a high level, there's both reasons for serious concern and also reasons for optimism. And of course, we focus on both and try to address the concerns and try to push the levers that we have to enable greater ambition. I'll just use two statistics that I think are that are meaningful and help us with the optimistic frame. The first is, and Mark Carney gave a speech yesterday at Columbia. I call everyone's attention, when I say yesterday, on Monday, I call everyone's attention to it, in which he reported that now $88 trillion of assets under management in the private financial markets, investment postures, but to strong 2030 targets along the way. Meaning that these are investors who are not simply saying, oh, in 20 years or in 30 years, we're going to be decarbonized, but who are saying we're going to be decarbonized in 30 years and we're going to have strong targets in only 9 years. And so that's action representing a significant portion of the overall financial markets. That's number one. Number two, on the other side, we have governments now representing nearly 3/4 of global GDP who have said the same, that we governments are committed to a net zero posture by mid-century, and about 55% of global GDP has said that by 2030, we're going to achieve targets that are consistent with a 1.5 degree warming future, which, as you know, is the kind of upper limit of what scientists believe we can reasonably accommodate. So there's cause for optimism here, both in private market developments and obviously on the policy and broader kind of geopolitical engagement. Are we doing enough? No. Is it going fast enough? No. Those are the efforts that we're working on at Treasury and across the administration to kind of push things faster.
Well, that neatly raises my next question, which is that Treasury has emphasized with your appointment and the creation of the hub that tackling climate challenges is a huge priority. Can you broadly outline at a high level what Treasury's climate priorities are and the role of the hub and yourself in tackling them? And then we can drill down a bit.
Sure. So, Secretary Yellen created the Climate Hub and appointed me earlier this year as as an indication of the seriousness with which Treasury is taking climate change consistent with the administration's broader focus on climate. My job and the hub's job is to really threefold. One is to coordinate and manage Treasury's overall climate activities, and I can talk to those in a minute what they are. Number two is frankly to be a bit of an agitator and a bit of a thorn in the side of people throughout the building and the department to kind of push and always be asking the question, can we be doing more? And what more can we be doing to use Treasury's tools, authorities, and expertise to further push action on climate? And number three is to kind of represent and promote Treasury's climate activities, both in fora like this, but also within the interagency process and with external stakeholders. So it's kind of a threefold role. And I would say that the overarching kind of organizing principle of how we think about and how the Secretary thinks about Treasury's climate activities is, what are we doing? What more can we be doing to assist in the market transformation of our economy to enable the ambitious net zero goal by mid-century that the president has set, and the 52% reduction in global greenhouse gases in our own greenhouse gases that the president has set for the 2030 timeframe. So how can Treasury use its tools and authorities and expertise to accomplish those goals? And as you know from your time at Treasury, Treasury sits atop of quite a large number of functions that have a direct relevance on that question. You know, we do tax policy, we do budget policy, we do regulatory and oversight work via our posture as chair of the FSOC, or Financial Stability Oversight Council. We can talk about that later. And of course, we are the voice and the vote of the US government with the multilateral development banks, the Green Climate Fund. We sit on the board of the US government's DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. So we have significant standing to affect the question of how capital is allocated, deployed, and mobilized toward the net zero goal. And that's really what we seek to do. And what I seek to do every day is ask, are we being ambitious enough? How are we using our tools to get there? Maybe I would just say that as I think about the four areas that Treasury has the ability to affect that transition to net zero, and affect a market transition. You know, the first is informing that transition. We're focusing a lot, specifically in our work with the FSOC right now, on data and making sure that market participants have access to reliable, comparable, decision-worthy data upon which they can make decisions about how to allocate capital. So that's about kind of informing the market transition. The second is about kind of guiding that transition. And we spend a lot of work both domestically and internationally in fora like the FSB, the Sustainable Finance Working Group, helping to promote standards that can help guide capital flows towards a Paris-aligned, sustainable future. So that's guiding the transition. The third is about incentivizing that transition, and obviously the work that we do on tax policy is probably furthest out in that area, helping the White House, working with the White House to guide tax policy that can guide the flow, that can incentivize the flow of capital to the net zero transition, and then finally mobilizing capital for the transition. We're spending a lot of time now working both. Well, I guess in particular with the multilateral development banks in pushing them, encouraging them to focus on how to use their funding and their sources of public finance more effectively and efficiently to leverage additional private capital to on behalf of climate projects and programs in developing countries. So I think that's an overview of how we do what we do and the tools that we have at our disposal to help guide this net zero transition.
You mentioned fiscal and tax policies, obviously a very important tool for affecting incentives to address climate issues. A carbon tax could raise revenues, discourage emissions. It could be distributed back to society. Infrastructure bills can offer critical support for renewables. We don't have a federal carbon price in the US. What are Treasury's key priorities on climate-related economic and tax policy? And do we need to do a better job in using fiscal and tax policies to a greater extent to affect relative prices for carbon emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe start with the elephant in the room, which is the question of carbon pricing. I think again, it's said so often in fora like this, but I think pricing carbon is a I think widely agreed by Republican and Democrat economists alike as an efficient way of accomplishing policy and societal goals. I think we see around the world a rising number of carbon pricing schemes and mechanisms that are working with varying degrees of efficiency and effectiveness. That's not a tool that we have at our disposal now, and so we are working, as you asked in your question, with fiscal incentives that we have in fiscal policy to help accomplish some of these important, policy goals for the administration. I would say that I should highlight two of the proposals that are now working their way through Congress: the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the reconciliation bill, which are now currently under discussion. And both of those packages, Treasury has been intimately involved in their development and in the elements of what's within them. Both of them would lead to historic amounts of public capital for mitigation and adaptation in climate through increasing the resiliency of our infrastructure, to accommodate a changing climate, constructing thousands of miles of new transmission lines to accommodate the addition of more renewable energy, and investing in nationwide electric vehicle charging network. So there's a lot of targeted fiscal stimulus that we think, and fiscal support that we think is important. And in the coming, hopefully, weeks and months, we will have more clarity on those packages. In terms of tax policy, those bills and others have a pretty unique and expansive set of green tax credits to encourage more clean energy investments in the private market. And importantly here, this administration and Treasury certainly sees the transition to a net zero and to a low carbon first, and then a net zero economy later, as a necessary and important thing to do, not just for environmental reasons, not just for moral and social and equity reasons, but because we really do see this as the driver of significant long-term job creation and wealth creation for this country. I think that's one fundamental difference in terms of how this administration thinks about this transition from previous administrations. And that's largely because the economic imperative of this transition is becoming increasingly clear. Not only are there significant dangers of inaction from the standpoint of stranded assets and unpriced externalities, which at some point are going to come back and bite, but we also see a significant competitive advantage and imperative for us to move relatively quickly. Other countries are moving quickly to decarbonize and develop technologies, the underlying technologies that will drive that transition. The US needs to not just be part of that transition, but to help lead it. And I think this administration's policies with respect to incentivizing the kind of technologies, not of the future, but frankly of today, is part of a much larger competitiveness, innovation, and economic growth plan. In the past, addressing climate change has been seen as a cost needed to be borne. I think we now realize that it is not a cost needed to be borne because the cost of inaction is far, far greater than the cost of acting, and that there are, in fact, significant economic benefits to moving faster and in a more definitive way.
So turning to the world of climate finance, Treasury is not a regulator per se, but it plays an important role on the Financial Stability Oversight Council. It leads that. And then Treasury has important roles internationally. It's there on the Financial Stability Board. It leads on the G7 and G20 finance channels. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what are you doing in the FSOC to advance your agenda, and how do you assure the independent regulators are rowing in the same direction as you? And then, in terms of the Financial Stability Board and the G7, G20, what are your main priorities? And if you had 30 seconds to tell us about the G20 Sustainable Financing Group, where Treasury and China are co-chairs, that would be great.
Great. So, I guess the first thing I'd say is related to the FSOC. So the FSOC is the Financial Stability Oversight Council. It is a council chaired by Secretary Yellen, Secretary of Treasury, and consists of the 15 independent regulatory agencies. And the word independent is important to emphasize there, because while Secretary Yellen chairs that group, she chairs a group of independent regulators. And the FSOC members and the FSOC as a council was charged in the president's May 20th executive order with coming back to the president within 180 days, which takes us into kind of mid-November, with a report on council member efforts to integrate consideration of climate risk into their policies and programs. And this follows on the heels of the Secretary Yellen convening, in her first convening as Treasury Secretary, she convened the FSOC members back in March, late March, for a conversation specifically around climate and climate risk. So basically from the day that she has come in, she has been setting agendas for the FSOC and encouraging work streams related to this question of climate risk. And then the EO came out further charging that group to come back to the president with a report. That process has been ongoing for the last now 4.5 months, and we are on track to issue that report to the president by mid-November, if not before. And it will importantly lay out where member agencies are in their current efforts to assess climate risk and integrate climate risk into their activities. It will point it will lay out a set of recommendations for how to enhance that work and speed up that work going forward. And it will lay out a specific set of kind of timelines and next steps for action. So this report is not an end in itself. It is a step along the way for on a pathway for these regulators to increasingly incorporate climate risk into their actions. What that means for each regulator may be slightly different, but the direction of travel here is very, very clear, that the regulators see climate as a risk which needs to be more incorporated centrally into their operations and dealt with in a more unified and coordinated way across government. And that's what the FSOC can bring to this process, that coordinating function. You asked about the international work that we're doing. It is active and perhaps not surprisingly, because of course, during the previous administration, while the US was, let's say, taking a relatively hands-off approach, maybe that's a kind way of saying it, to kind of climate engagement, our European and international colleagues were moving ahead quite rapidly. And Europe in particular has a lot to show for that work. And so our work at the FSB and with the Sustainable Finance Working Group is really helping to coordinate and lead, I would say, the re-entry of the US as an active player into the climate risk conversation at an international level. And I'd say our biggest, our biggest area of focus is ensuring that what is agreed to at the international level and systems that are being put in place at the international level are, we have this debate sometimes around the word harmonized with the US system or interoperable with the US system. And I think our view is that there's not going to be a single system. There won't be a single global carbon price. It's unlikely that there's going to be a single global taxonomy for climate risk. But what we can do is to make sure that the systems that are being developed by different jurisdictions are interoperable and they work together. to make sure there's somewhat of a level playing field across jurisdictions. And so that's how I would characterize our very constructive work, both at the G7, the G20, the FSB, and with the Sustainable Finance Working Group.
Well, thank you. Let me turn to the bilateral. Since you just mentioned the word harmonized, I had started a USEU financial market dialogue ages ago, and we debated this very issue: is harmonizing. I always came down in the camp of consistent and convergent and outcomes-based equivalence. So I can give you a whole lexicon after this show on how to approach that. Nothing doesn't seem much has changed at Treasury. But is that are those financial discussions, a good forum for talking to the Europeans, particularly because they're quite advanced on the taxonomy debate, and since we're on Treasury's bilateral responsibilities, China is the world's largest emitter and the largest global coal consumer and source of international public finance of coal power generation. At UNGA this week, President Xi announced ending financing for overseas coal projects. So what's your reaction to this announcement? And since I mentioned China, are the US and China able to cooperate effectively on climate at this time?
So there's a lot there. And first of all, I hopefully am inaccurate in pushing back a little bit on your statement that maybe things haven't changed that much at Treasury. Perhaps not on the wording and the application and the relevance of the word interoperable and consistent and comparable and to harmonizing international financial systems and challenges. But I think with respect to climate, I think you would probably agree that the attention to climate is at a historic level and for good reasons, right? So.
Let me be clear. I was referring to the lexicon, not to your bold actions.
No, of course. I just had to be on record as pushing back against that. No, look, I think first of all that the Joint Financial Regulatory Forum, which you I think alluded to a moment ago, is we consider that to be a continuing a very productive and useful way of exchanging information with the Europeans on this and other key issues. The next forum is scheduled for later this month, I believe. And that continues to be a forum in which we are able to exchange information, ideas, suggestions, and in a low-key trusting environment, and so it's been a very good addition to the way that we engage the Europeans. I think the question of taxonomy on one hand that has come out of Europe, I think we need to first of all applaud European leadership over the last many years. They have been working extremely effectively and hard to put forward a system, a proposed system that they believe will help guide the same market transformation that we are seeking to achieve, with our policies. We take issue with some of the constructs, but the burden is, I think, as much on us now, not to simply, criticize it, but to propose alternatives. And so we are doing that. We are moving from a posture of kind of standing back in the previous administration to now re-engaging and developing our own proposals on how to come up with a system that works for the US, is interoperable, and accommodates the significant and positive work that the Europeans have done. And one fora for doing that, probably the most important fora for doing that, is the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which we, as you mentioned, co-chair with China. On China, the announcements earlier this week that President Xi made in his remarks to the UN General Assembly regarding coal and the fact that China will no longer support finance overseas coal, is extremely important. There are a lot of questions, as there are with any big policy announcement, around what does it mean exactly? What is the timing? When does it apply? A lot of questions to be answered, but at the highest level, for China to indicate that it is stopping the overseas coal financing when it has been historically the largest by far financier of overseas coal is a really big deal. And it plays nicely into the much larger push internationally that the US has been leading again for the last 6 months, and we certainly did so under the Obama administration, to get other countries to do the same. Within the OECD, we, the U.S. government, signed on to a pretty strong statement again earlier this week, last week, I'm sorry, to end OECD financing for overseas coal. There's a couple of holdout countries that are, that are still holding on, but I think China's announcement puts them in a increasingly difficult spot. I mean, if China can do it, one would argue that other OECD member countries can do the same. So I think it puts us in a good position to have, perhaps by COP, by the Conference of the Parties in November, a very clear declarative statement on COP from major industrialized countries. And that, of course, is it has been a key objective of this administration from day one. Finally, the collaboration with China on climate, I would characterize as strong and continuing. I think China sees this as in their best interest to move quickly. They have been very effective at using fiscal stimulus to develop technologies that are consistent with this net zero transition. And so I think they realize the imperative to move is not just a geopolitical and diplomatic imperative, but it also plays to their longer term economic interests to repurpose their economy and to reorient their economy. And I think in that framing, we find common cause with China quite often.
Great. Well, we have about 3 minutes left. Let me just ask one last question, which you could probably spend hours on, but you'll give you 3 minutes. And it's about the status of the advanced economy efforts to mobilize 100 billion per annum for developing countries, and Treasury, the MDBs, the climate investment funds, and the like. And could you tell us a bit about your engagement on the $100 billion goal and how the MDBs have reacted to your call to end fossil fuel support?
So just for your viewers, to remind your viewers, the 100 billion goal is a goal that developed countries put out many years ago, maybe some 10 odd years ago, that by 2020 and now by 2025, pushed back by 5 years, developed countries would commit to providing and mobilizing up to $100 billion per year annually to developed countries to support clean, green investment activities. So that's a mandate that largely falls on the back of the development finance institutions, the multilateral development banks, et cetera. The latest figures show that we're around 80 billion per year in combined public funds and mobilized funds. And so, there's a $20 billion delta to get there. A couple thoughts. One, President Biden just announced again earlier this week, his commitment to seek a significant amount of additional funding in public budgets to as part of the U.S.'s contribution toward that $100 billion goal. We are pretty confident that with that increase, plus increases that have been announced by a number of other G7 and G20 countries, we will get to that 100 billion goal by 2025, if not before 2024, perhaps even earlier. So I think we're going to get there, but that number always obscures a much bigger and more fundamental point, which is that collectively we need hundreds of billions of dollars annually to flow into developing countries to support their transitions. So 100 billion is important, but we need to move quickly beyond and past it. And the way to do that is the thing that we're focused on now, both with the multilateral development banks in terms of getting them to focus more on mobilizing private capital to achieve their development objectives and their climate objectives. But importantly, it's also working at the top of the financial funnel and encouraging net zero commitments and strong climate commitments from large institutional investors. Once those pledges are made, those pledges are out in search of projects and programs and funds and opportunities to invest. And so we think that both by working with the MDBs to focus their efforts on climate and capital mobilization on one hand, and working with financial institutions to encourage strong net zero and Paris-aligned climate commitments, we can not just get to the 100 billion, but quickly move past it. And at the end of the day, success here is private markets driving this transition, not public markets having to put 1 billion here or 1 billion in there. It's private markets moving to a net zero posture and supporting investment activities that are economic and good for the planet at the same time.
Well, that's fantastic. We've run out of our time. I'm sure we could go on for much longer, but I want to thank you profusely for joining us today. Thank you, John Morton.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Appreciate it.